Welcome to We Don't Have Cookies with your host, Jason Marshall.
Hey everybody, thanks for downloading the show. I have a good one for you today. I'll be talking to one of my favorite people in the world. He's the host of the very popular storytelling podcast called Risk. He is also a cast member of my favorite sketch comedy show of all time called The State. The one and only Kevin Allison is on the show today. But before I talk to him, I want to talk to you. I want to make a few changes to the podcast, and I want your input. What are your favorite things about the podcast? What would you like to see more of? What would you like to see less of? I'd like to know, so if you could email me, jason@wedon'thavecookies.com, and let me know, I'd really appreciate that. Also, if you go to the website, wedon'thavecookies.com, and go to the Get Involved section, there you'll see a lot of things that you can do to help the podcast that take very little time and no money. If you'd like to donate to the show, that'd be great too. There's a donate button at the bottom of the website, and anything you send will go right back into the podcast. Like I said, I want to make this podcast better, so if you have a few minutes, I would really appreciate it if you'd help me out. I'm going to play a Bad Life Coach segment by Dave Nelson, and I'll be back.
Needing help to remove any obstacles or challenges that might be holding you back from success in your business or personal life? Let me help you create a course of action that will take you to the next level personally and professionally with some Bad Life Coaching. And remember, the sense of self-purpose that you have created is more important than anyone else's.
My next guest was a cast member of one of my favorite TV shows of all time called The State. He is also the host of one of my favorite podcasts called Risk. It's the one and only Kevin Allison. How you doing?
Hey, I'm great. Thanks so much.
There was a boom in sketch comedy in the mid-90s, but two shows that really stand out was The Kids in the Hall and The State. I was a big fan of The State. My two favorite people on the show were you and Michael Showalter. You guys were just so expressive, and it didn't seem like I was watching somebody playing a character. It seemed like that was the person, you know?
Oh, that is so nice to hear. Yeah, The State, we all met at NYU when we were freshmen. And, it was 11 people. So there was an incredible amount of rivalry and competition in that group. And I was incredibly nervous in the time that I spent in the group because I wasn't one of the stronger writers. I mean, I could write very, very funny stuff, but it was quantity. One of the keys was if you could write like 2 great sketches a day to come in and pitch, then you were sure to be getting, the people who wrote the sketches cast the sketches. So the way the whole thing worked was whoever was a really good quality writer that could churn out stuff on a regular basis, those guys got to cast everything. So I spent my entire time in the State really nervous and insecure about the fact that I wasn't cast in as much as most or as several other members of the group were. But it really warms my heart when I hear from people, oh my gosh, you kind of stood out for me. Your quirkiness or whatever was fun to watch.
What kind of background in comedy did you have prior to the TV show? Did you do improv or stand-up or anything like that?
That's the fascinating thing about The State is people don't understand that, at least in New York City, there wasn't comedy education at that time. There was no UCB theater. There was no The Pit or the Magnet. There was maybe very briefly, several years after the State broke up, there was briefly a little outpost of Second City in New York, but that didn't last. So when we were freshmen at NYU, we were not going off of any specific formulaic sort of teaching that we'd learned. no one in the group really had improv classes to look back on, or sketch comedy classes. So what we did have was that we all grew up watching Sesame Street and the Electric Company and the Muppets. And then, once we were a little bit older, we started discovering SNL in the mid 70s and Monty Python. And we were all huge fans of all 5 of those shows. So we kind of just based what we were doing off of what we'd seen done before. And there was an incredible amount of invention amongst the group. Like, there was an incredible amount of, well, I've never seen this before, but what the fuck? Would this work? And I loved that about the group. The group had an extremely unusual work ethic and attitude. The attitude was, rather than researching something and learning how to do it beforehand, learn to do it while you're doing it. Like for example, after the group broke up, the guys who went on to do Reno 911, they were like, well, we still have never taken an improv class before, but why don't we learn how to do improv by creating a television show that's all improvised? You know what I mean? Like, that's exactly the ethos that I brought to Risk. If you go back to the first episodes of Risk, that is literally the beginning of my storytelling career. I had only just, a couple months prior to starting the show, had even gotten up on stage telling a true story to begin with. So I was extremely new to storytelling when I created Risk, and I kind of learned storytelling as I was creating the show.
Well, as a fan of yours, I would have to differ with you on that. I think it started probably back in Catholic school.
Oh, yeah. Well, that is true. That is true. There's definitely seeds of learning everything that I do today going back into my grade school years. That is for sure.
The state was extremely popular, especially even when it ended, but it seemed like it ended really quickly. It was just on for 3 seasons. What happened? Why did it go away?
Well, there's a remarkable article on the day that you and I are recording this in the Hollywood Reporter about Les Moonves. It's an article that was written by the woman who created the show Designing Women, about how in 1995, when he was hired to be the head of CBS, apparently it wasn't just us that he screwed over. Apparently it was a lot of people that he treated like garbage when he came in there. The state, we did 30 or maybe just under 30 episodes for MTV. And then we thought we're too big. We believe in ourselves too much. We want to move on to something bigger than MTV. So we tried to get on network television. Now, this was when there were still like 4 major networks, if you include Fox, and cable was still like couldn't keep up with them, mm-hmm. and cable was still kind of limited. There weren't a bazillion networks like there are now. So yeah, we wanted to make the move from MTV to either CBS or ABC. And we were hired finally by CBS. We were hired to do at least 3 or 4 holiday specials. Contractually, they were supposed to give us at least 3, I think. And then depending on how those holiday specials went, there was supposed to be a Halloween, a Christmas, and a New Year's, I think, or something, something along those lines. And we did the Halloween special the very week that Les Moonves was hired to take over CBS. And apparently, from what we've heard, he was just like, I've got too much on my plate right now. There's a bunch of kids who want to do a sketch comedy show. Like, I don't think so. I don't even have time to look at this. Just fire. Yeah. So we didn't even get the other specials that they were contractually obligated to give us. Yeah, yeah. And it was, the idea was that if the specials went well, then we'd get our own series there. But, that just unceremoniously ended our TV career. And it really left us shell-shocked.
Speaking of special, do you think the show ending so soon is what keeps it special to the fans? Because there was absolutely no time for it to ever go downhill.
That's an interesting question. I grapple with that because the state was, in fact, a cult phenomena. It was never quite as popular as, say, Beavis and Butthead, for example, if you compare us to another show on MTV. So it had an audience, but it had a small, very, very, very passionate audience, people who got it. The thing about the state was, at the time, people were used to what I would call corporate sketch comedy. That is SNL or Mad TV. And when I say corporate, I mean those shows have a particular feel to them. And the feel is, this is not just a group of friends who all get one another's sense of humor and have a group mind together and are really one unit, like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. Those shows feel like, this is a network that put a bunch of people together and the writers are not the actors, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a big machine there. But when it comes to the state and Kids in the Hall, and then later Mr. Show, those shows definitely have a very, very distinct flavor because they much, much, much more reflect the quirks and nuances of a few people's sense of humor coming together as, the chemistry of a few people working together. So the people who really got the state were super passionate about it. But here's the deal. I now create a podcast, Risk, which also has a very small and extremely passionate fan base. At maybe the most popular night of viewing of the state that ever happened, it might have been 2 million or 2.5 million at most tuned in that night. As far as Risk goes, the most we'll get is 1 million downloads per month. So these are nice audiences, but they're small audiences. And so I'm just very used to being a cult favorite with the projects that I do.
I want to ask you about your podcast in a second, but you brought up the Mr. Show with Bob and David. There is a lot of similarities between your show with the state and the Mr. Show because it seemed like the sketches a lot of times bled into the others. And the reason I bring that up is the Mr. Show got another run on Netflix. Is there ever been any talk, or do you see there ever being any talk of the state having another run, either maybe MTV brings it back or something like a Netflix special or something along those lines?
There's been a lot of talk of that over the years, and I, in recent years, have been a big proponent of the idea that maybe we could do an animated series. The reason I bring that up is that, we all live in, most of the state lives in Los Angeles, but getting from one end to Los Angeles to the other, takes a lot of time. And we all have such different schedules. But if we were doing an animated series, then we could all literally be recording a lot of it, maybe even from home or just from the nearest, voiceover studio to where we each live. I think that would work amazingly. And I think Netflix would be the most obvious place for it to live because David Wayne is in pretty tight with them, having done, Wet Hot American Summer over there. But it hasn't materialized. We've done a couple of reunions in the past decade. We did we did that Festival Supreme that Jack Black organizes over in Los Angeles. We did that one year. And we've also done San Francisco Sketch Fest at least once, maybe twice. So, those are just one-off appearances, but we had a ton of fun doing them. So, yeah, I think we would love to work together again, because it really is true that there is nothing quite like the chemistry of those 11 people together. It's quite irreplaceable.
You have your own podcast called Risk. It started up in 2009. I believe I started listening a year or two later. How do you explain the podcast for people who haven't heard it before?
Well, a lot of people might be familiar with narrative radio shows like This American Life or The Moth or even Snap Judgment. So Risk belongs within that general genre where you're going to hear people telling true stories from their lives about peak experiences that they've had. But the difference, the big difference with Risk is that it's incredibly uncensored. The Moth, This American Life, Snap Judgment, all those shows are on national public radio. So they have to be family friendly. On Risk, we do not say, oh, don't get too emotional, don't break down crying because, that might be a little too disturbing for people. Or don't get too kinky in your sexual descriptions of things. Don't describe violence with too much detail, et cetera, et cetera. No. People on Risk, they're encouraged to step outside their comfort zone and boldly share with as much raw and real honesty as they can the most impactful things that have happened to them, whether they be absolutely hilarious. There's a lot of absolutely ridiculous, embarrassing, funny stories that are shared on Risk, or totally terrifying stories or beautiful stories, tear-jerking stories. So one episode of Risk might contain 3 stories that take you in wildly different emotional directions. But the reason our fans are so passionate about it is they write emails to us every day saying, oh my God, I don't feel like I hear human beings speaking as frankly and as openly anywhere else in the media as on your show. And this restored my faith in humanity. Like I feel less like I'm a freak, and I feel more compassionate to people who are different than me. And all sorts of emotional stuff has resonated in me since I started listening to your show. So we love that about it. It's a place where people can kind of come out of the closet about anything, whether it be the most insanely, ridiculously embarrassing thing that ever happened to you, or maybe something that was really traumatic, or maybe something that like was a spiritual, like transcendent, blissful moment for you. So it really, really is incredibly rewarding working with people on these extraordinary stories. Many of them are well-known people, writers, comedians, performers, directors, but many are just ordinary people who love the show and heard us calling for pitches and wrote in saying, oh my God, if that person could share about their child molestation, then I think I can share about, my insane mushroom trip, Yeah.
I love the podcast because of that emotional diversity. I never know if I'm going to be laughing or crying, but I do know whatever the story is, I'm going to be invested in it. And you always have this really well-placed backdrop of music in the background. How did that come about? Is that something that you always envisioned? When I first started listening, it was already there. And I remember you actually put out episodes of the best of Risk music. And it seems like that's a big part of the podcast. Where did that come from?
Yeah, that's fascinating. The entire idea for the entire series occurred to me on one night. I had been doing these crazy, kooky character shows. After the state broke up, I thought to myself, what can I do now that I'm all alone? I used to be in this big group and there was safety in numbers, but now all of a sudden, like I have to create a solo career, and what do I do? So I thought, well, maybe I could do sketch comedy, but as one person. So I would come out on stage and play some insane character, like a guy who thinks he's Charles Manson, or, Frankenstein's creature or something like that. And then I'd kind of tell a story as that character. Actually, Whoopi Goldberg did an amazing show on Broadway in the early to mid 80s that was kind of an inspiration for what I was trying to do there. But it never really took off. I never really got it to really connect with people and take it to another level. So Michael Ian Black came to see one of my shows in early 2009. And it was 5 characters. And afterwards he said, I wish you would drop the mask, stop putting on an act and just get up on stage and tell your own true stories. And I said, oh, but I'm such a freak. I mean, I'm too gay and too kinky and too Midwestern and polite and too absurdist and too serious and spiritual. Like it's such a strange amalgam of things that make up who I am. So I said, that feels like too much of a risk. And he said, risk is the word. That's the idea. If you get up on stage and feel like you're taking a risk, then you're probably opening up to the audience. So the audience will probably open up to you. So I was like, holy shit. Okay. I feel like I really, I kind of felt like I'd been hearing that same advice rumbling around in the back of my head for the prior, decade or so anyway. So I was like, okay, I really got to try this thing he's talking about. So I went back to New York and I went to the UCB theater one night and I told the story of the first time I tried prostituting myself, and literally the weekend before the state was hired for series. But anyway, so I told that story, and I was incredibly moved by how different the experience on stage was, by the way that I was able to look into the audience's eyes, and that I kept feeling like, oh, they're going to hate me. But instead they kept leaning forward and really were in tune with me. And afterwards, people didn't just say that was funny. It was a funny story, but they didn't just say that was funny. They were saying things like, holy shit, I've never prostituted myself, but the emotions you described at that one point in the story triggered this memory for me of this fight that I got in with my dad when I was in the 7th grade. When you tell true stories, there's a certain amount of emotional resonance that tends to come through that can really open up all kinds of stuff in the listener's mind and heart. So I was very inspired by that. And I walked away that night and I said, this is what I've got to do. I've got to create a show called Risk, where people tell true stories that they never thought they'd dare to share in public. And it's got to be live stories told on stage, because I've got to force myself to be getting up on stage on a regular basis. Because for the prior 12 years after the state had broken up, I had all kinds of stage fright and social anxiety, and I was really avoiding getting up on stage, and it just really killed me. So I was like, I've got to do something where I have a deadline that is going to force me, no matter whether I want to or not, to be getting up on stage talking to people. And I knew that it also had to be a podcast. This was 2009, so podcasts were still kind of new, but I knew that I had to have some way to go beyond small room comedy, because for the past 12 years, small room comedy had gotten me nowhere. And I knew that I wanted the live stories told in front of an audience and radio style stories, because I kind of admired This American Life, the way that they were able to get certain kinds of intimacy out of people when you're recording someone just one-on-one. So in 2009, I realized, oh my God, I've always been an audiophile. I've always loved records and sketch comedy on records and doing phone pranks and stuff like that. I always loved recording stuff. So I started listening to a lot of This American Life and shows like Joe Frank's old show. And I kind of became really intrigued of how can we make this storytelling podcast a little bit special by including music in between the stories, just like 30 seconds of a great song, and including music in some of the radio style stories, music and sound design. And so, yeah, it became a real, our being interested in creating a show that, yes, is mostly these incredibly honest stories, but also has this interesting audio texture to it. So I kind of loved, it's interesting. In the first 2 years, the podcast had a lot more audio experimentation going on. We had lots of indie bands sending us stuff, and we had lots of sound collage artists sending us stuff. And since then, we've pared it down a little bit because it was just too much to keep up with. But we still have a good deal of that on there.
I have a follow-up question about something you said. You mentioned that you tried prostitution right before the state started. When it ended, did you ever think of going back to that? Because being on MTV would really raise your rates.
It's funny, Aretha Franklin just died. And so I always tell people that after the state broke up, what I actually ended up doing was cater waitering. Because, we didn't make any money on MTV. I mean, we made little bits of money, and there were certain people like Michael Ian Black who were incredibly frugal and very, very wise about investing what little they had from what we made. But not me. I was a real hand-to-mouth kind of guy. You know what I mean? So after the state broke up, I became a cater waiter, and it was so humiliating because the show was still in reruns on MTV, and I would get recognized left and right. So there was one time where I was pouring champagne in a little room at the Grammy Awards. I think it was actually the Vanity Fair party after the Grammy Awards that all the Grammy attendees were going to. But anyway, Sarah McLachlan started to walk into the room, and then Aretha Franklin walked right next to her, and Sarah McLachlan was like, oh my God. She said, Aretha, can I get you a glass of champagne? So they came up to my bar, and Sarah McLachlan looked up at me, and she said, oh my God, what are you doing here? And Aretha looked at her like, huh? And Sarah McLachlan said, oh, he's a very successful comedian. And Aretha raised her eyebrow and said, mm-hmm. So yeah, that is what I consider the perfect illustration of my low point.
Well, you've doubled down on storytelling. You've opened your own school called the Story Studio in NYC. What made you decide to go down that road? You've kind of went over it, but to open a story studio and to teach people how to do storytelling, you even do that for corporate events. You've really went all in on this.
Yeah. What happened was shortly after starting Risk, I realized that, this really felt like a vocation, like a life's calling, because working with people on their stories was such a rewarding part of the process for me. Being the editor/therapist kind of guy who's asking people questions and helping them see how to reshape things and, working it out with them was such a kind of moving and fascinating and cathartic experience for me that I decided, wow, this has so many uses in life, to be able to communicate with the kind of the emotional content that comes through in narrative, and to be able to understand better how you're communicating with a beginning and a middle and an end, and to be able to know how to use a lot of sensory details in order to help people see and hear and feel what you're talking about. Those are skills that are useful in all kinds of areas of our lives. So I decided to start teaching storytelling, and the classes immediately formed based on what people were asking for. We realized right away, some people want it in order to tell stories at shows like Risk or The Moth. And some people want it in order to further their career, in order to, do sales pitches better, or just chat with people over, cocktail hour in their networking that they do for their jobs. So we started teaching two separate kinds of classes, the storytelling kind of for the stage and storytelling for business. And eventually there were so many people wanting to take those classes that I started an official business out of it, the Story Studio. Now, I don't personally teach so many of those anymore. I do every now and then. It's the corporate ones that are incredibly time consuming. And so I have a staff of people that are doing those for me now. What's really interesting about corporate people is they want to take these classes in order to stop speaking in circles, speaking in broad, words that don't mean anything, just corporate speak. They're very used to just speaking about data, and in order to prepare the workshops for them, you often have to go through very many conversations over the phone or meeting in person with them first, where that's all they're doing is speaking in circles and giving you data and stuff. And you're like, yeah. So, hey, here's how we do this, It takes a while to get it across to them. But once you do, they are so excited. Like our corporate workshops, it's really funny. People will often start off by saying, I'm boring. I'm dry. I don't think I have anything that's interesting to talk about. And then once you get them to see how to do it, it's amazing how much fun they start having with it.
I think I'm going to play a song called Boring by the Arrogant Worms when I go to break, just because of that. That was great. But you also have a book out now called Risk that has the best stories that were ever told on the podcast. After 9 years of storytelling, how hard was it to pick what went into the book?
Oh, God. Yeah, it was brutal. I listened back to all the episodes. So we've had over 400 episodes now, and I narrowed it down to 600 possible stories that could be in the book. And then I just kept narrowing it down further to 300, 150, then 50. And there were a couple of things that we had to keep in mind. They wanted, the Hachette, the book publisher, they wanted to make sure that we got some celebrities in there. And we do happen to have some fantastic stories from celebrities. So, Marc Maron is in there, and Aisha Tyler, Michael Ian Black, Lily Taylor, Dan Savage, AJ Jacobs, Paul F. Tompkins. So those are really fun stories. And then, of course, we wanted to go with just some of our all-time classics, some of the stories that are just unforgettable from the time we spent. But they also wanted at least 6 or so stories that have never been heard on the podcast before. So that was really interesting because, we've always got this huge backlog of stories we've recorded and that we're planning on putting on the podcast, but just haven't gotten to yet. So that was actually much easier than we thought it was going to be, because we were like, oh, no, we have several in mind right off the bat of what we really want to get on the podcast, but could hold off on for a bit. So it's great because what happened was we transcribed the stories as they were originally told on the podcast. Then we sent it to the original storyteller and said, start making some changes to this because you might have forgotten some stuff. There might have been some stuff that you've learned since you originally told the story. Some of it might sound weird because of, the way it sounds on the page as opposed to when spoken. And then we gave it a serious edit through on our end as well. So the stories are similar, but different enough that when people are reading them, they're like, this felt like I got completely new insights from it. Or, oh, wow, there's this new thing that happens in the story. And then there's also like Q&As with all the storytellers afterwards. So the book has been a fascinating process because it's kind of shown how these stories can take on a different life in a different format.
Earlier, you mentioned having a Midwestern background. You grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. Do you ever come back to visit your hometown?
I visit at least once a year, usually Christmas. We're actually, I have avoided doing shows in Cincinnati, specifically, to be totally frank, because of my parents. My parents don't really know how to work with the internet. They don't really know how to get email, and they don't know how to download podcasts. They are very aware that I create a show that is very uncensored, that is kind of R-rated, or to be frank, X-rated a lot of the time. But, I know that my parents have always been like liberal Democrats as far as that goes, but they're also very, very old-fashioned, like devout Catholics. And so, especially when it comes to issues around sex or, the morality around marriage and stuff like that, like they're very, very old-fashioned. And, I think that they would be really, really thrown by a lot of, it's just very interesting because Risk is a window into all kinds of things that happen in people's lives. Like, in the book and on the podcast, there's the story of the guy who became a huge drug cartel guy who ended up being kidnapped and tortured for 40 days because he screwed up with the drug cartel. Lost, almost $100,000 or something like that. Or there's the really, really kinky stories. Like I tell a lot of stories on the show that have BDSM involved or going off to kink camps and stuff like that. So I know that my parents would be alarmed by a lot of what happens on the show. It would just be very outside their purview of the world. So I've always avoided going back to Cincinnati, but we are finally going to do that in November.
Oh, nice.
And I think I might make a point of just making the Cincinnati show that we do. They can definitely be risky stories, but maybe I'll pay a little bit more attention to whether or not there's sexual content or, make sure no one's saying I hate Jesus or something like that.
Just take a step back and say, hey, you know what would be a refreshing change? Let's do a PG show. Let's just see what happens. We'll do it in Cincinnati.
Well, we actually do want to create a series for National Public Radio that would be a PG version of Risk, because the thing that, I referenced this earlier, the thing that gives me the most agita is the fact that our audience isn't bigger. I feel like Risk is so damn compelling that it deserves an audience about 5 times bigger than it has right now. And so we think one way to break through might be if we take a look at our whole catalog and find stories that are not so outrageous, stories that are good stories, but not so uncensored that they couldn't be run on the radio, and put together a series of maybe 15 episodes that could run on National Public Radio and sell those to public radio stations. And on those episodes, I would say as the host, hey, if you like what you heard here and you're up for listening to something that's a little more risque, something not safe for work, check out our podcast too. Subscribe to Risk to hear the not PG rated version of this show. So hopefully that would bring some more attention to us.
That's a really good idea. I like that. But I'm in Dayton, Ohio, so I'd like to come up and see your Cincinnati show, and hopefully maybe sometime we can do this in person or just have a cup of coffee. Either way, it'd be great to meet you.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I want to thank you for being on the show today. Where can people find you, your podcast, and the book?
Well, you can find Risk at risk-show.com. And then, on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, we're at Risk Show. People can find the Risk book wherever books are sold, but also you can just go to theriskbook.com.
All right. And I'm going to take a quick break. I'm going to play that song by the Arrogant Worms called Boring, and I'll be back.
Okay, great.
I like to talk about the weather. I like to talk about the weather. I like to talk about the weather. It's the most fascinating thing I know. I like to talk about science, how humidity affects prevailing winds. I talk about the atom and the speed of light, but everybody turns away. They say I'm boring, kinda boring, but I have a lot of things to say. I'm boring, kinda boring, but I really think that I'm okay. I like to read the morning paper and tell everyone the secrets I have learned. The economic forecast and the classifieds and the bridge column most of all. 'Cause I'm boring, kinda boring. Do people think that I'm a fool? I'm boring, sorta boring, but I'll show you all that I am cool. 'Cause I can rap. That's right, I'm boring, a real L7. Vanilla ice cream's my idea of heaven. Heaven, that's a place that I call home. Nobody calls me on the phone. They don't fax, they don't text, they don't email me. I got a page on Facebook to see all my relationships become platonic when I show my collections of comics. 'Cause I got Batman and Superman and Turkey Man. He can sort of thinks he's flying. He gets the criminals with the gobble punch. Sometimes it bothers me that when I'm in the room, people leave. But I've got someone to talk to, at least until my bunny rabbit dies. I like to talk about my bunny. I like to talk about my hair. I like to talk about my stamp collection. I bring it everywhere. 'Cause I've got first day covers. I got first day covers of all the stamps from the 1976 Olympics. That was 32 years before Adrian was born. Truly boring. But I really think that I'm okay. I'm boring, really boring. But nobody calls me on the phone. I'm boring, really boring. But I'm never bothered by telemarketers. Thank you. Thank you.
Want to contact the show? Send an email to jason@wedon'thavecookies.com or call 929-266-9342 and leave a voicemail.
Those are two ways to contact me, and like I said at the beginning of the episode, I'd love to hear from you on how to make the show better. Next week, I'll be talking to some of the members of the We Don't Have Cookies family for the Thanksgiving episode, but I've been trying to line up guests for the future. I reached out to legendary Cincinnati Reds player and coach Pete Rose to be on the podcast. When I was a kid, I met him and his son at my family's cell phone store. He bought some phones and he was going to do some promotional stuff with us. That was back in the early 90s. Anyway, I sent an email to his representation, and 2 minutes or less, they replied and said they were not interested at this time. I've never heard back from a potential guest that quick in the entire time I've been doing this show. I don't care if he won't be on. I'm more impressed with how quickly they said no more than anything. I also want to let everybody know that I still plan on doing the podcast meetup on March 2nd. I just haven't had much time to focus on it with everything that I've had going on lately. But as of right now, it is still happening, and hopefully I'll have more on that in the next couple of weeks. I want to give a shout out to Jason Lampro for leaving a positive comment on the podcast over on Podbean. Make sure that you check out his podcast, The Mixed Media Forest. I also want to give a shout out to Choo Choo Stew and Chris Doyle for their well wishes during my surgery. I want to thank Kevin Allison for being on the podcast, the Arrogant Worms for letting me play their music, and Dave Nelson for the Bad Life Coach segment. Make sure you check out his podcast too, Comedy A Go-Go. I want to thank all of you for listening. That's it for me this week. I'll talk to you next Monday.
Thanks for listening. Tell your friends about the show and leave a review. See you next time.
I'm such a freak.